Okay, well, hello and welcome to the last event of Michaelmas Term for the Oxford Forum for Questioning Extremism, Refuge or Refoulement, Britain's response to the refugee crisis. Today, we aim to discuss Britain's involvement in Europe's current refugee crisis, with particular regard to the Nationality and Borders Bill, which has been proposed by Home Secretary Priti Patel, and which will be an enormous overhaul of the British asylum system and will limit the rights of asylum seekers in the UK. This bill, which was proposed earlier this year, has undergone a first and second reading and is now in the report stage, which gives the House of Commons a chance to discuss and consider any further amendments. This bill has received criticism from the United Nations Refugee Agency and a recent publication commissioned by the human rights group Freedom from Torture in a legal opinion led by human rights QC Raza Hussain, which concludes that this bill represents the biggest legal assault on international refugee law ever seen in the UK. Since 2018, the number of refugees that have attempted the dangerous journey to cross the channel to seek asylum in the UK has grown to what some have called a crisis. Only a few days ago, the tragic news that at least 27 refugees drowned after trying to reach Dover was reported. As an ever-increasing number of people risk their lives to find safety, we must consider the reception and asylum system that they will encounter in the UK. Our discussion of the bill and its implications will last around 40 minutes, which leaves about 50 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. In this final segment, I will be able to unmute you and you can ask your questions directly to our panelists by pressing the raise hand feature. It is now my pleasure to introduce our panel. Dr. Ceri Oeppen is co-director of the Sussex Centre for Migration Research and a senior lecturer in human geography at the University of Sussex. Her primary specialism is the geography of migration, including the ways in which migrants and refugees maintain connections across national borders via transnational activities, whilst also integrating in places of settlement. Dr. Oeppen coordinated and wrote a response after the Centre completed the government's consultation on the new plan for immigration policy statement, the policy statement that became the content for the Nationality and Borders Bill. Clare Moseley founded Care for Calais, a humanitarian aid charity, in 2012. The NGO began distributing essential aid to the jungle in Calais and has since expanded operations to supporting refugees in the UK as well as mainland Europe. After the recent Afghan resettlement program in the UK, Care for Calais has coordinated one of the largest drives to deliver aid to these refugees. Hannah Marwood manages the legal access team at Care for Calais and works to ensure refugees have legal access and supports them through the asylum process. Thank you all so much for coming to speak to us today. I'd like to begin by offering the panelists a few minutes to explain their work in more detail. So Dr. Oeppen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you so much, and thank you for being here and for inviting me. So I'm the co-director of the Sussex Centre for Migration Research at the University of Sussex, and this centre brings together researchers working in lots of different disciplines on the theme of migration. I'm particularly interested in Afghanistan and the Afghan diaspora, and most of my research has been about Afghans in various different settings. And of course, this year, Afghanistan has been back in the news again for some rather sad reasons. In terms of the sort of things I've worked on, Liza mentioned that I led the consultation response from the Migration Research Centre. So that was alongside lots of different organisations. There was a really strong response from the sector, from academics and from charities, not-for-profit organisations, responding to the policy paper that formed the basis of this bill. because really as soon as it came out, people realised quite how bad it is particularly for refugees, but there are some other issues in the bill as well for other migrant groups too. So we responded kind of line by line to the bill, building on research in the centre, but also wider research from the not-for-profit sector and other academics, just pointing out some of the things that we found to be issues with the bill. The other organisations will know that this consultation process was hugely problematic. We were given 6 weeks to respond. For those of us in universities, those 6 weeks were over the Easter holidays as well, so trying to coordinate responses from colleagues across different departments was difficult. Normally these sort of consultations have double that time, so this was unusual to only have 6 weeks. It's a real issue in terms of the policy paper being only in English, so people who ultimately directly affected by this weren't able to respond to the consultation. Some organisations, like I know Refugee Action was very active in this, did try and get some responses from refugees and asylum seekers in the UK, but largely the responses were coming from English-speaking organisations, and so obviously the kind of responses were of a certain type. And then the other issue with it as well is, of course, that although lots of people filled in the consultation citing problems with the bill, it doesn't really seem like they've taken our comments on board. The policy paper that they put out for consultation, the issues that we raised with that are still there in the bill as well.
Thank you so much. Claire, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you so much. So I'm Claire. I started the charity Care for Calais some years ago. Before that, I actually had a completely different background. I was not a humanitarian aid worker. Starting the charity was almost an accident. And before that, I knew very little of current affairs. But for the last few years, I have spent a lot of time reading about refugee situations here and abroad, which has been a very depressing exercise. The first few years, I was based full-time in Calais. Then we started to work in the UK, largely because our government has slowly withdrawn support for refugees to the point where we were getting calls from people around the UK and their state was starting to be nearly as bad as the people that we work with in Calais. We were actually getting calls from refugees in the UK who literally had no shoes, who had no clothes, who in some cases were struggling to get food. We've been taking food parcels to refugees in the UK. Not a situation that you expected to encounter. Our work really has three strands to it. The first is the direct aid. So in France and in the UK, we deliver the things that they need, the everyday food, clothes, shelter in France, the bits of everyday life. The second strand to it is the support, because for refugees everywhere that we work with, the things that they have been through are very traumatic. The situation that they're in right now quite often is difficult to deal with. So there's a lot of support we provide, both in northern France to help them get through the trauma of how they're treated, and in the UK to try and help them cope with the mental stress of waiting for their asylum claims to be heard, which is something not to be underestimated. And then we have the services Hannah will tell you about, which is our legal access team. And then the third part to our work, which is incredibly important, is the advocacy. And in terms of that we are probably a fairly new organisation on that side. But it is so important. You cannot work with refugees nowadays and not become political about it, because everything that is happening to them is political. The way that refugees are spoken about in the media and by politicians, the way that people think about them in the UK, the amount of misconceptions that lead to the way that they are treated. It is impossible, I think now, maybe a few years ago, we had volunteers who would say, I'm just a humanitarian worker, I'm not political. I honestly don't believe it's possible nowadays to work with refugees and not be political. But what we have learned is that the work that we do, the experience that we gather, gives us a great opportunity to do a lot of advocacy work, from witness statements, from what we see in our work, from gathering and documenting our experience, to working with the lawyers, to speaking out in the media and speaking to politicians. There's a lot of stuff that we can do. And as I said, there's a lot of stuff that we have learnt, and most of it is not good, but I'm sure we'll be exploring that throughout this session. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Hannah, would you like to add anything about your role within Care for Calais?
Thank you everyone. So as Claire said, my name's Hannah. I manage the legal access team at Care for Calais, which is a team of incredibly passionate and dedicated volunteers who work sort of as a referral mechanism to link asylum seekers with legal representation in the UK. There's a lot of barriers that asylum seekers face when finding legal representation. You have lack of language and literacy. Some people will have no English whatsoever. They might lack literacy skills. They might not trust the system. They lack confidence. So having someone to sort of help guide them through that process is, we found, incredibly important, especially given the cuts to legal aid over the last couple of years. There's a lot less legal aid solicitors out there. They're all struggling with capacity. So having an extra support system to find a solicitor willing to take on a case is a huge thing that we can do for people. They also just help support them throughout the length of their asylum claim, whether that's preparing for interviews, gathering documents. That inevitably stretches a lot further than just referring them to a lawyer as well. So we have caseworkers who will help get children to school, help get GP appointments and everything else that an individual will need to get through an incredibly hostile asylum process. Off the back of doing that as well, we managed to get quite a large client base in the last year we've been doing it. We've helped nearly 2,000 asylum seekers find legal representation. So we do see a lot of patterns quite quickly as to what's happening on the ground and the sort of policies that asylum seekers are beholden to. So where we see that and we're potentially not agreeing that it's something that should be happening, we will get that information across to some incredible solicitors that we work alongside to try and challenge the Home Office. Some examples of the work that we've done in that would be, we were quite a large part of the challenge against Napier Barracks in Kent earlier in the year that went to the High Court, which was ultimately found to be unlawful and inappropriate accommodation, which was good news. The bad news is it's still being used, obviously. Other examples are challenging phone confiscation policies of the Home Office, restriction on movement that asylum seekers face. And most recently today, we just announced that we are challenging the Home Office's pushback policy, which is part of the anti-refugee bill that is going through Parliament at the moment.
Great, thank you so much. So firstly, I will ask a few questions on the current ways in which refugees enter the UK and seek asylum, and how this will change under Priti Patel's new border law bill. So Ceri, the United Nations Refugee Agency has expressed concern that the bill will create a two-tiered, discriminatory asylum system. What will this look like, and what effect will this have?
Yeah, and this is, I think, gets at the heart of the issues with the bill. And I think UNHCR have said that the bill doesn't respect principles of refugee law, and I totally agree with that. The UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency's convention relating to the status of refugees, says explicitly that people shouldn't be penalised for the manner in which they arrive in the place where they're seeking asylum. And what the bill is proposing is that precisely people should be penalised for how they arrive. So if people arrive through these supposed safe legal routes that we're yet to really see, then they will have certain rights and privileges that people who arrive through other means won't have under the bill. So it would basically be a two-tier system, this idea of the kind of good refugee who sits quietly in a camp somewhere waiting to be resettled, and the bad refugee who comes with the assistance of a smuggler, whether that's in a boat, in a lorry, on a plane, but they will not receive the same support and assistance that those who are resettled will under this bill. And that's precisely what UNHCR, myself, I'm sure Claire and Hannah too, see as a problem with this bill, this two-tier system.
Thank you. Claire, if the proposed bill is passed, it will allow for the interception of boats attempting to cross the Channel and redirect them away from the UK. How do you imagine that this will change the conditions in northern France for refugees?
Well, first of all, and most importantly, it won't stop people from coming. And that is really key, because that's why they say that they're doing it. But I mean, as we have seen so shockingly in the last couple of days, the whole theory with refugees is that you can't stop them coming by deterring them, because the things that they are running from are so awful that they're not going to stop running. You know, they're running from the worst things in the world. They're running from bloody conflicts. They're running from torture. They're running from persecution. And so they're not going to stop coming. And that's the theory. And that is what we're seeing. You know, some people drown this weekend. That's awful. And then the very next day they carried on getting on the boats. And this is kind of the same. People might get turned back, but people will carry on trying. But the other side to them getting turned back is that more people might die. And that is incredibly serious. And so I think that what we will see is increased desperation. We'll see increased fear. But what we won't see is people stopping coming. And that's really the worst thing about this bill, is that in a lot of ways, it is going to really, really hurt very vulnerable people. But what it's not going to do is achieve the objectives that the government wants to achieve. And that is the tragedy of this bill.
What do you think, this might be something that you all would want to answer, the effects of this bill will have on the lives of asylum seekers in the UK, given the additional punitive measures and the heightened sense of precarity?
Again, it's going to be really, really bad. Already, what was probably, I think, the worst thing that we see at the moment in the UK is the effect of delaying people's claims. We have, there's a big backlog in the Home Office system. I think that it is possibly to a certain degree a deliberate, backlog by design. The effect of the inadmissibility provisions is that we have people whose claims, we have people who have had claims ongoing for 17, 18 months. And the thing about an asylum claim is it is a matter of life and death. If you're a refugee, going home can mean a death sentence. It's that serious. And sitting there and waiting for your asylum claim is incredibly stressful. And already we are seeing, I mean, there's a guy who used to volunteer with us, and he is one of the strongest, most competent and clever people that we know. But his asylum claim is now at the 17-month thing, and we have watched him in front of our eyes crumble and turn into a wreck, really a nervous wreck, a person who is not okay, who is not competent, who is having serious mental health problems. And that's one of the strong ones. That's somebody who, you know, who really was together. And that's common. We see people break in front of our eyes from the stress and the strain of simply not knowing whether or not they're going to get asylum. And this bill is going to increase this, because it's going to mean that there are more people whose claims take longer to process. And then for the people who are, as you said, deemed to be the bad refugees who've come the illegal way, they're not going to have the certainty. They're only going to have the temporary protection. So they're going to be left in longer and longer periods of this uncertainty, this fear. And that fear breaks people. So really, we're not even really giving them sanctuary, which is the whole point of refugee protection, is to give people sanctuary. But if we're not giving them that feeling of safety, which is the essence of sanctuary, it's evil. We are destroying people. It's almost like another form of torture. I mean, this year we have been through hunger strikes for people. We have seen an inordinate number of suicides. We have seen people smuggling themselves out of the UK. My disappointment in the system, my disappointment in the UK are at a high level. And this bill is only going to make it worse. It really is. The words are it is an attack on the UK's asylum system, but it is an attack on the most vulnerable people in the world. It's a bad thing.
Yeah, can I add something to that? So yeah, Claire, I completely agree with everything you said, and it is really horrific to see people who have already in many cases been through terrible things, the things that led them to flee their country in the first place, but to then see that kind of compounded and made even worse by the system in the UK and in other European countries as well. I just think as Claire says, we're supposed to be providing sanctuary, but actually we're not even in the kind of do no harm. We're actually actively doing harm as a country to these people by keeping them waiting. Claire mentioned earlier the mental stress of waiting. These people are in limbo often for years. They're not allowed to work whilst they're asylum seekers. There's a campaign around that at the moment to try and change that, but it's a waste. And when I talk to people who have been through this system, that's something that comes up again and again, this feeling of that they're wasting their lives. A lot of these people are relatively young. If their life had gone differently, if they'd been born like I was in the UK, then they would probably be at university or working, but they're sitting there in a really kind of dire situation and just feeling their life kind of slipping away from them. And then also to add to what Claire said about people will still come, and it doesn't matter how much they try and make the border stricter, people will still come because the situations they're fleeing are so bad. But what will happen is not only will it become more and more dangerous as the border controls become stricter, the smugglers will make more and more money out of people in really vulnerable situations. Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, claims that this bill will break the business model of smugglers. It won't do that. It will make them more money. And I already see that happening where people are trying to get out of Afghanistan because the situation in Afghanistan has got worse. Smugglers are putting their prices up. And as borders become more and more controlled, it pushes people to more dangerous routes, longer sea crossings, higher mountain passes, colder routes, and it pushes them into the hands of kind of having to spend more money to get out. It certainly doesn't break any business models, and I've got no idea on what basis they're saying that, because there's no research out there that shows that making border controls stricter will stop smugglers operating.
Thank you. Hannah, do you have anything to add about like the legal access side of how asylum seekers' lives might change?
I think the temporary status is going to be a big thing that might affect the way that we work. If people are going to have to go and get visa renewals every 30 months is what's proposed in the bill currently. As has already been said, the mental health toll it's going to take is going to be huge, but the practical toll as well, and having to support people through visa renewals, which I can't imagine will be very effectively managed, considering that the whole asylum system at the moment doesn't appear to be very effectively managed. So that's probably what we're going to see on the legal access team. And I think there's also going to be a risk that with these constant deadlines happening for the visa renewals so often, people are going to fall into really terrible situations. They might become undocumented if they have personal crises at the time of visa renewal. Then that's how people fall out of the system. And once you're out of the system, it becomes incredibly hard to get back into it. You're not available to any services. There's also the no recourse to public funds effect as well, unless it's in cases of destitution. So life is going to be incredibly monotonous and difficult with no way out of it. There's nothing to aim for. Like, even when you're having your asylum claim process, you still have the hope that at the end you're going to receive your papers. But when those papers do come and they're on this temporary precarious route, it's going to be a never-ending cycle.
Thank you.
Hannah, maybe from a legal perspective, I don't know if you've seen this bit in the policy around this bill, that they want to penalise people for making kind of additional evidentiary claims. And that's really worrying too, because I mean, there are good reasons why people might have a certain body of evidence and then be able to add to that later on, because situations change, or they're able to get some kind of documentary evidence from family in their country of origin they didn't have before. And that I find really worrying, that they'll penalise people for doing that.
We're already seeing that as well. We're seeing people being issued with notices to provide all of their reasons for claiming asylum when they first enter the country. And as you said, it's not realistic whatsoever to expect people to do that. Circumstances change, different arguments can be made, evidence can be found. People who have been through incredibly traumatic experiences as well, they might not feel able to disclose certain details until much later down the line, and you're denying them an opportunity to do so. So yeah, that's a particularly horrible one as well, which does seem to already be in effect.
Thank you. Claire, how much impact do you think that NGOs can have on the refugee crisis when the government is making it so difficult for refugees to try and seek asylum?
That is a very good question. And I guess there's two sides to it. The obvious one is that across Europe, unfortunately, we've seen a fair bit of criminalisation of NGOs. And that hasn't overtly hit the UK too badly yet, that we know of. Although it has, to a certain extent. We've seen some of it in France, and we've encountered some of it in France. And the way things are going, I don't think I would be too surprised if we encounter that kind of behaviour in the UK, to be perfectly honest, right now. The way that things like this bill are going, I mean, it wouldn't be a surprise, would it? The really big issue for us, in terms of affecting change and how things happen, for me, the real root to everything is comms. We said before that everything happens because of the way that people think and talk about refugees. And I really believe that a lot of the stuff that happens in this country is because there are some heavily embedded misconceptions out there. So, for example, a lot of people in this country believe that people in Calais aren't what they think of as genuine refugees. It's not true, but that is what people believe. A lot of people in this country believe that if you don't claim asylum in the first safe country, you are then not a genuine refugee. That's not true, but research shows that a lot of people in this country believe it. A lot of people believe that they're not refugees at all, they're illegal immigrants because they're entering illegally. Not true, but that's what people believe. So the power of communications, the power of speech and words affect things massively. And the way refugees are treated in this country really is affected by what people think and believe. And whether or not this anti-refugee bill goes through is affected by what people believe, and by those things that I've just mentioned, that a vast majority of people in this country actually believe things that aren't true, but that will affect this bill going through. And so the communications, control of the media, all of that side of it is incredibly important. And the government are really good at it. The anti-refugee bill was brought in by what I would describe as a comms campaign. I think we all know that Brexit was put through on the back of a very well orchestrated comms campaign, because that must have been one of the best comms campaigns in the whole world, I think, ever, a star case study one. And the anti-refugee bill is being put through on the back of another comms campaign. And the problem that we have is we are a fairly small voice. And even other refugee organisations are a comparatively small voice compared to, for example, the British government. In the last 2 days, it's really been brought home, the death of 35 people in the Channel, sorry, went down to 27, but it's a very, very big event, a pivotal event, I think, for this country. And I spoke a lot in the media about this. I did a lot of interviews, but really my voice was a small one compared to a lot of politicians who basically the most commonly heard phrase in the last 2 days was, we need to stop the people smugglers. And that is the main message that came out from everybody. And that, if you like, I would argue is another misconception, because people smugglers are not a cause, they're a symptom. I'm not saying they're good. We want to stop, yes, we want to stop them, but overall they are a symptom, not a cause of a problem. But that is what the British public now believes. And the power of the media I cannot overstate the importance of it. And that is the biggest problem that I think that we have. Sorry, that was quite a long-winded answer.
No, thank you so much. Ceri, I saw you were nodding. I don't know if you had anything to...
Yeah, again, I wanted to support what Claire's saying, and the people smugglers are providing a needed service, getting people out of dangerous situations. We might not agree with their methods, and there's no doubt that some of them are exploiting people, but at the moment there is no other option for people. If you come from a country like Afghanistan or Syria, Sudan, you can't just apply for a visa and get a ticket to London. It's just not an option, because the visa will be refused because they assume that they're going to claim asylum. So the only other option is to go through smugglers. So Priti Patel is talking about how they want to stop these smuggling routes and provide safe legal routes. So they're just not providing those safe legal routes. And we see that with the Afghan citizen resettlement scheme. They announced that as the evacuations ended. So the end of August, Boris Johnson said, we're going to shift heaven and earth to get people out of Afghanistan. Well, they haven't. The citizen resettlement scheme, which was much lauded by the government as they use the terms world-beating too often, but they were really kind of trumpeting this amazing resettlement scheme. It's still not open. The last update on the website was the 13th of September. If Afghans try to find out more about it, they just get told, refer to the website for updates. Likewise for lawyers and other people involved as well. So they're just, until they provide safe routes for people to seek asylum, then people will use smugglers because they're fleeing real danger. And I think the comms issue is just really important. So the comms this week have been about stopping smugglers, and lots of discussion of migrants and illegal migrants rather than refugees. The majority of people who arrive through the Channel, and actually most people don't arrive through the Channel, that's also important to add. It's only a tiny proportion of people who arrive by boat, but most of those people are from Afghanistan, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Eritrea, Sudan. Then they're not migrants, they're refugees. And when the Home Secretary is using the terms illegal migrants, then it's not really surprising if members of the public also use those terms. They're certainly not providing a good example at the top to the public around comms. And yeah, the comms around the policy, this bill, they've been very professional. There's been lots of social media, kind of beautiful graphics about how we're providing safe routes that isn't actually backed up at all in practice.
I suppose my next question kind of leads on in terms of the comms, but it's about the even though kind of really tragic events and terrible conditions that refugees endure are really widely reported, there's still this prevailing sense of apathy about the refugee crisis, especially amongst the British population. And what causes this, and how can we solve it?
Shall I take a first go at that? I mean, there is apathy, but there is also a lot of positivity. I mean, there's lots of people who are helping people when they arrive, and I'm sure Claire's seen this as in terms of people wanting to volunteer for organisations. And I think the kind of charity sector, the sanctuary movement in the UK has been really important as well. They've really stepped up and stepped in where the government has let people down. So often when when asylum seekers are destitute, it's churches, charities, food banks stepping in to help these people. So yes, there is apathy from people, but actually there is also a lot of positivity out there. So I think it's really important to remember that. I mean, in Brighton, which is the nearest town to my university, we've had people arriving from Afghanistan who still haven't been given a proper immigration status by the government, but Brighton Council and local residents have stepped in to support those people without any support from the government. So I think that's a kind of, there is a positive side to it too, I guess is what I'm trying to say here.
Claire or Hannah, would you like to add anything to that?
Just to follow on, I think, from the positive message that Ceri just mentioned, I think a lot of it is down to miscommunication, like what we've all talked about just now. The media publishes stories that create an apathy, so that the British public, that they feel like they've got no care for people that are arriving who are economic migrants, which is not true. But when they have that vision of these people that are arriving, they think that they're not in need of help. However, I think what we've seen is that education and informing people really does matter, because once you sort of tell the human stories of the people that are arriving, it does create a lot of compassion, and we are compassionate people, I think. It's just a matter of the comms, like Claire has said before.
Yeah, thank you. How do you think the British government could use the opportunity of proposing a new bill to make the asylum system better?
I don't know how to answer that really. I mean, there are ways that they could, but I just don't see any political will to do it. I mean, the key ways that they could is firstly by recognising that whatever they do to try and, in their words, disincentivize people taking these so-called illegal routes, it's not going to stop people coming. So wouldn't it be better to incentivize people taking safe routes? To incentivize that, we have to provide the safe routes. I mean, that's the main thing that they could do, whether that's by providing humanitarian visas that give people a safe option to come here to apply for asylum, expanding the resettlement program, but also just even doing some of the things they say they're doing and they're not doing in terms of providing what little resettlement they do provide in a timely way in response to crises as well.
In terms of Calais, what we need is a safe route. I mean, to us, it's really obvious that there's a really annoying thing that Boris Johnson said yesterday repeatedly, was that they were going to leave no stone unturned to break the model of people smugglers. Whereas we would say, if there was a safe way for people, I mean, the issue is that the people in Calais want to claim asylum in the UK, and they can't do that because they have to be physically present in the UK to claim asylum. And the only way to get here is to take a journey on a small boat. which is terrible. As Ceri said before, these are people who have suffered and escaped from some of the worst things in the world, and having escaped from them, they shouldn't have to then risk their lives just to get to the UK. So if there was a way for them to get there safely, that would put the people smugglers out of business. You know, if there was a way that they could have some kind of screening in France to see if they're likely to have a claim, and if they are, then they could be transferred to the UK and have their claim properly heard in the UK. No more people smugglers. That would do what he says he wants, and more importantly, it would save lives. So for us, creating the safe route is absolutely the obvious policy. And it's really annoying to hear him say we will leave no stone unturned, you know, when that's a big stone that is unturned. And I got very sick of hearing all the politicians saying that they were going to do all they can, when I'm thinking, well, you're not doing all you can, because you're not even talking about this, and there is a way to stop people dying, and this is the way. And, you know, let's be frank, they are coming anyway. It's not like we would be suddenly creating something where they're coming, they are coming. So what we need to do is to control it and do it humanely. In terms of the Home Office, I think that there is the really basic problem with the Home Office is that refugee law is there to give people asylum, and if the objective of the Home Office was to give asylum to the people who need it and not to give it to the people who don't need it, then the whole process would be much more functional. At the moment, the objective of the Home Office is not to give asylum to people as much as possible. The problem with that is that when all their workers are assessing the claims, they're not getting the right training and they're given the wrong objective. And that means that they're saying no to a lot of claims that, according to the legislation, should be granted. So that's why they've got massive, massive waiting lists, because they're saying no to a lot of claims that are then getting appealed, and they're dragging on for years, and the waiting lists are building up, and it's getting more inefficient. And then we've got lots of people who are sitting there for months or years waiting for their claims to be heard. And then we've got hundreds, thousands of people in accommodation, and everybody's saying, why have we got thousands of people in hotels waiting, and those people can't work? If they started with the objective of, let's try and work out who really deserves asylum and give it to them, and who doesn't and not give it to them, then there wouldn't be all these ongoing claims that Priti Patel gets so upset about, because they'd be getting to the right answer. It's so dysfunctional to be not trying to get to the right answer. If they were trying to get to the right answer, then the percentage I think that are right at the moment is about 40%. How about we took that straight up to 80%? Then there'd be much fewer claims that have to go to court. Things would be heard much quicker. There wouldn't be the massive backlog. There wouldn't be so many thousand people sitting in hotels for years on end. We wouldn't keep hearing they're in hotels at taxpayer expense, because they could go and get jobs and get on with their lives, which is what they want, which would stop all the mental anguish and cut the taxpayer expense that we keep hearing so much about. It's basically, it's really dysfunctional, simply because the objective at the top of it is wrong. If you set the wrong objective, your whole system isn't going to work. And to me, it's kind of as simple as that. It has the wrong objective, so everything is going wrong around it. Yeah, that's what the Home Office needs to do.
Hannah, do you have anything to add from like a legal access standpoint?
No, not particularly. I guess the one thing, if you're in a perfect world, which this does sound like it would be, is kind of going on from what Claire said, using accommodation that's appropriate and treating people with dignity. That's definitely something that can change. We work across, I think, 140 hotel or barracks accommodations across the country, and the word hotels, I think, needs to change as well, probably, because the hotels that are used are pretty grim. They're run down. They're often away from community centres, so people are incredibly isolated, and that the whole system just needs to function for the benefit of the people moving through it, not for the sort of cost-cutting profiteering that it currently has, and just have a bit more of a social care aspect to it, to look after these people, because the more you look after them, the more they're going to be able to contribute later on and feel more comfortable. the Home Office isn't going to have as many legal challenges as it has for putting people in a disused army barracks and whatnot. So the whole system would function a lot better if the policies were created from a care perspective.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
To add to that, I think the Home Office, they're so desperate to not be seen as a so-called soft touch, that they create these awful policies that treat people, really barbarically. But it comes back full circle to what we were saying at the beginning. It doesn't, nothing's going to disincentivize people from leaving a war zone if their life is in danger. And equally, if people have family in the UK or if they have connections in the UK, they're going to try and come to the UK rather than another country because it makes sense to be where your connections are. If you speak some English, it makes more sense to try and come to England than Norway, for example. So I think that this whole kind of idea that somehow if they're as punitive as possible, that it will stop people coming, just is not reflected in the research at all. That's not how people make the decision to seek asylum, to seek refuge. They don't look at the policies of the Home Office and compare that to UDI in Norway. They go to where they feel that they'll be safe, where they feel that they have a future. The Home Office policies are not going to stop that. They just make it miserable for the people who are going through that process.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's probably all the questions that we have time from me, but I'd like to now open the floor to questions from our audience. So if you raise your hand, I will be able to unmute you and you can ask a question to our panelists. So we've got from Eliza.
Hi, thank you so much to all the panelists and Esme for running the event. It's all been great, but I just had a question. To anyone on the panel, do you think that if this bill is passed, it will set a new precedent that other European countries might follow?
Really good question.
I think that's possible.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I think that there are a few countries in Europe that are basically, our government is moving more towards the right, and we are seeing that in other countries in Europe. And one of the scary things about Brexit is, does it set a precedent? And yes, I think that there are other countries in Europe that would feel more comfortable to move in this direction if the UK moves in this direction. So horribly, I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, I agree.
Freya, I will.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for this event. It's been really, really interesting. Sort of to Claire and I guess Dr. Oeppen as well, like, I'm curious what you think about, there's a lot of talk about the value of comms and getting certain messages through people's heads, but like, it seems in particular, Priti Patel and Number 10 are very much like seeking to appease a very loud but small minority of people whose answer to, it's not illegal to seek asylum is that, well, it bloody should be if it's not. Like, I'm trying to think of how to ask this question, but what are sort of other strategies when that doesn't work, like when you hit the limits of that kind of common strategy to try and make a difference, I guess.
Okay. What we have found is that the things that make the most difference, I think, are firstly legal means. Working with human rights lawyers is fantastic because when you win a case, they have no choice, they have to listen. So from an advocacy perspective, that is definitely something that works. The other thing that works is working with journalists, because one thing this government does listen to is public opinion. So if you can get a bit of momentum, I think, for example, this worked with Napier Barracks, apart from the fact that it is still open, but changes have been made there. Some progress has been made. People are not kept there for as long. There have been some improvements. We are now working more closely with the accommodation provider there. And that, a lot of that, as well as the court case, was the public opinion and the journalists. The journalists did a really good job there of bringing the issues to public attention. And in fact, with the Afghanistan thing, when the people were flown out of Afghanistan, there was a swell of public support, and the government paid attention to it. This government does react to public opinion, so I think that journalists and lawyers can definitely be our friends here.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the danger is with the media is that things kind of ebb and flow in terms of public interest and journalist interest. So I think it was really positive to see the journalistic and public response to the situation in Afghanistan around the evacuations. But we see it slipping down the media agenda. So when the government says, oh, we're announcing a resettlement scheme, but then don't follow through with that, and if it's not as high on the media agenda, they can get away with that. So I think it's about trying to find kind of new ways to speak to the media and indirectly to the public through the media, to try and keep that agenda there, to keep the interest. And that's where kind of people's stories, narratives can be really important. But then there's also the issue of, if you're using people's stories and narratives, how do you make sure you do that in an ethical way where you don't risk re-traumatizing them, that you're not exploiting their stories? So there are lots of challenges around that. Beyond the media and lawyers, I think also kind of local level organizations. So that's what part of what the Sanctuary movement is about trying to kind of create local level conviviality between refugees, other migrants, local people, through community activities. And I think that's where a lot of positive work is happening. There was a study probably about a decade ago now that found that media coverage in local newspapers of asylum seekers and refugees was much more positive than the national newspapers. And I think that's because it often linked it to a local story and people could relate to it. Whereas in the national press, particularly in the tabloid press, refugees are presented kind of en masse as using all those terrible words like horde and flows and floods, and so they're not seen as individual human beings, whereas the local press can kind of counteract that a little bit.
Great, thank you so much. I will just allow the final question to be asked.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I think my question is just that I think it's quite easy to sort of rationalize like why people might come from countries that are that are war torn, or people who are fleeing from direct threat. But I feel like what's harder to sort of argue for is people coming from so-called safe countries, like, for example, France, like people who have already fled once and are then fleeing again. What do you think is the best way of sort of rationalizing that, other than sort of things like family ties or things like that?
I think there's a lot more than family ties as to why people want to come here. There's family ties, yes, but there's also English language skills. A significant amount of people apply for asylum elsewhere in Europe. It's a really small amount that we see that do want to come to the UK and who do make it to the UK. And quite often it is people from countries where there's historic relationships with the UK. So whether that's from our colonial past or they have the English language as a second language there. So there's a lot more around why people want to come to the UK. I think as well from the people that we speak to, and perhaps quite disappointingly as well, they put the UK on a pedestal of being, it will offer them a fair and just process. And when they get here, unfortunately, that's not what they're seeing, and they're incredibly disappointed in that. And quite a lot of people lose hope. But I think it's just the wording around it, I think we need to be clear on the reasons why people come here, and the idea that there are loads of people coming is completely incorrect. It's not a crisis of numbers. The numbers that are coming to the UK is perfectly manageable, and it's something that this country can deal with without any issues whatsoever. It's the word crisis should not be used when referring to the numbers of people. The only crisis is the fact that people are having to risk their lives.
It's a really difficult question. This, sorry to go back to something earlier, but I would say this one is a real comms triumph for the other side, because it sounds so easy and it sounds so obvious to say, in France, they're in a safe country, why are they coming here? That's a really easy one. Whereas to articulate the other side of the argument is that bit more complicated. But actually, the real other side of the argument is the safe country thing. Basically, what it is it's an excuse for the UK to take no refugees. That's what it comes down to. What it is in its essence is it's saying none of them should be in the UK, because nobody's ever going to enter Europe via the UK, well, unless they come on a plane. But the people that we deal with are not going to essentially enter Europe via the UK. So what it is really is it's an excuse for the UK to take no refugees at all. And if you look at it that way, actually, we take fewer refugees than most of our European neighbours. And so are we saying that the UK is less compassionate and less caring than any of our UK neighbours? Are we saying that the UK doesn't care about refugees at all, whereas other countries do? And we know that there are people in the UK who do care about refugees. So we're not saying that. And we're not taking more than anybody else. We're actually taking less than anybody else. So why should we take none when everybody else takes some? And that way round, the argument doesn't work. The difficulty is getting people to realise that it is an excuse for us to not take any refugees. And that's why it's such a clever argument, because it's easy to articulate the other side of it, and it's very difficult to articulate this side of it. And that's why it's a comms triumph. But that's the essence of it. The essence of it is, why should we take none when everybody else takes them? That's the real question. That's the real essence of it here. Are you saying that British people don't care at all or are more selfish? Well, no, we're not saying that, but that's the essence to it, if that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to remember the vast majority of refugees in the global south. So most Afghans are in Pakistan and Iran. Most people are in neighboring countries, basically. And I always find this focus on safe countries really interesting, because really we should be pleased if people want to come to the UK. It should be seen as a good thing. And I think it was on Twitter today, Deborah Meaden from Dragon's Den fame was tweeting, I'd love it if some of these people who are clearly kind of self-starters, entrepreneurial, active, healthy people are coming here. I'd love it if they came to work for me, because they're clearly kind of, people who I want to be working with, entrepreneurial people. So I do find it bizarre when we're complaining about people wanting to come to the UK. But I totally agree with Hannah that the colonial heritage, there's a reason why so many people around the world speak English, and that is part of it: language, family, social networks, expectations, all these things play into migrant decision makings. And there's a huge academic literature around this. It's worth having a look at the Migration Observatory with you there in Oxford, to have a look at the data on this of where people are going. But what does seem clear is that Priti Patel and co aren't reading some of this literature, aren't looking at how people actually make decisions and why they end up going where they go.
It's also highly ironic that the whole principle of people claiming asylum in the first safe country is the system that we left on Brexit. And yet that's the one that they're touting at the moment.
Well, I think that's all we've got time for, so we'll need to wrap it up there. But I just want to thank our fantastic panelists for your time. It's been a really, really insightful discussion. It's been a pleasure hosting you. So thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
Yes, thank you.